Hi, everybody. My name is Vandy Dubry. I am the Fine Arts, Literature, and Education Librarian here at UT Tyler. And I'm going to be walking you through understanding some primary and secondary sources for art and where and how to find them. This is going to be a quick introduction. It's not going to be an in-depth study. So we're going to get started here in just a second. If you are joining us now or as we go through this process, if you have a particular artist or anything that you're interested in looking for, you can put it in the chat. If you have any questions, you can also put those in the chat or just chime in and ask. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So to get started, there's some differentiation between what a primary and a secondary source is. And it goes down, it gets really into how and what you're using. Clear-cut answer is usually, it's a piece from the actual time period, firsthand account, evidence that's created by the witness to an event or an object. It can include, like we have here for art, it can be the artwork itself, the painting, the sculpture, the print. It can be a journal or a diary from the artist, an autobiography, which is what the artist wrote themselves. That's key and important in understanding a primary source. It can also be their correspondence or their letters. It can also be, for artists, it can be their notebook or their sketchbook. So for instance, if we're dealing with an older artist, like say Leonardo da Vinci, we have his sketchbooks, even Van Gogh, we have his sketchbooks versus his painting. You can utilize those as primary sources, depending on what you're arguing. For contemporary artists, we actually have a little bit more. So for a contemporary artist, you may be looking for things like interviews with that artist, whether it's a recording, it can be a print interview. Even from the 70s, they actually interviewed artists and published them in print. It could be their speeches, it could be their photographs of them. So if they were at an artistic gallery where they were showing their works and people came in and took photographs, there are archives of those. It can be recordings, either audio, visual. We even find, online on YouTube interviews of the artist. You can actually see the artist speaking their own words. Or modern day artists will have their own websites. And so that can be a very good primary source for a contemporary artist. When I'm working with students, when they're trying to figure out what a primary source is, what counts as that, we have to differentiate these, because I'll have students who wind up in contemporary art who've been used to doing more of the historical art pieces. And so they think, well, that's not credible. That's not something that I can use. Well, yes, it is. If it's an interview of that artist, that's that artist's own words. If it's the artist's website, that's them. That's tangible to that artist. And actually, if the artist is still alive and they have their website, usually you can send them questions. And some of them are very willing to talk to you about their art or about their life. When we get into secondary sources, that is typically stuff that's going to comment or interpret or analyze the primary source. Okay, so we're looking at biographies, things that other people wrote about the life of the artist, not the artist themselves writing the piece. Commentaries, criticisms, even in documentaries, video documentaries, reviews of artworks or reviews of a gallery showing for the artist. Those can be secondary sources. Where it gets really tricky with art is that, let's say I am, and I'm going to stop the screen share real quick. Let's say that I'm doing research on a piece that's actually a copy of a Rubens painting. Okay, so a lot of people, the older the artist, the more it's reproduced and copied and things. And you will actually have very famous artists who copied while they were studying art, they copied a piece. So let's say we have a Rubens piece that's been copied, and we're writing about the copy of the Rubens piece. Okay, so then the Rubens piece that is copied, the copy of it, becomes the primary source. The original Rubens becomes a secondary source. Does that make sense? So really, you have to judge your primary and secondary sources on exactly what you are studying and how you're studying it. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. So that gets into this stuff. So then how do you find these things? Okay, so now we're getting into doing the research of it. First is going to be a database that we have called ArtStore. Okay, this is usually one of my first stops for art research. I need to know if I can get my hands on the actual piece of artwork I'm studying. And this gets really complex sometimes, because with art, there's issues of copyright and ownership, and art can be bought and sold. And so a lot of times I'll have students that say, I'm looking for this image of this piece of art I'm studying, and I need to know where it is. Surely it's online. Not necessarily. If it's in dark storage in a museum and they haven't digitized it, it's not going to be online. If the museum actually sold it at auction, which they do sometimes to support the museum, then it's in a private collection. And that person has the right to choose whether or not to let somebody in to digitize and thus and such. So that's one of the issues, is I'll have students come into ArtStore and think ArtStore has everything, but it doesn't. It only has what it can get access to. And that's one of the issues of trying to do art research, is finding the images. With ArtStore, you will want to register your account. The first time you use it, you usually have to do it at our computers here. That's what registers you as a student. It's a very simple and easy process. If you are a purely distance student and you would like to use ArtStore, contact me and we'll work it out, and I'll get you an account, okay? But all we really have to do is just a quick, less than 2-minute form, and you're good to go. I'm going to go ahead and log into my account. Okay. The reason it's important to have an account in ArtStore is because that way you can actually collect the images, you can download them, you can put them in a PowerPoint, all of that. But you don't have to have an account just to search it. So I'm going to search ArtStore for it helps to spell correctly. And if you have had Lasso, we've discussed Caravaggio, right? You don't have to capitalize, but you do have to spell the artist's name correctly. And let me get this off of here. Okay. So I'm going to move the ArtStore piece. I mean the Zoom piece. But we can see that we have all of these images coming out of Caravaggio. You can also, pretty much any database, in the left-hand menu, they'll have limiters that you can use. So if you know that you want his prints, if you know that you want the paintings, you can go into those. We know who we mean as Caravaggio, but there are other people, other artists with that name. So when you see stuff like photographs, well, it may not be our Caravaggio. Okay. So just know that going in. You can also look at the museums that these are coming out of. If you know that the piece that you are looking for comes out of the National Gallery of Art, then click it and only have to go through 20 to see if they have the piece you want. So Okay, so now we're looking at the conversion of St. Paul by Caravaggio. One of the great things about Art Store is you can actually zoom in and it recalibrates. So you can see brush strokes. You can especially use this to talk about, how Caravaggio's fingers were and information of that sort. Let me get back out of here. Okay. The other thing with having your information over here, you can see where it's coming up at. There's our Caravaggio. We can make sure it's the person. We can make sure the date, if this is a copy of it. Sometimes the same artist will do multiple renditions of a topic and they'll have the same title. And you can say, okay, well, this one, the one I'm looking for is oil on canvas. This copy is a different type. Or this was a sketch of this piece, different things like that. This will give you information on. If you want this item, you can add it to a group since I have an account, and then I can later on go into that group, export it as a PowerPoint or a file to go into my paper. But I like to use this because this gives me a lot of information. The older the piece of artwork, the more titles it's going to have. And there's going to be a lot of different spellings of the artist's name. So that's something to pay attention to, especially when your artist is foreign, you've got diacritics and stuff like that. That can hinder when you're trying to get back to those primary source materials. So if I'm looking for letters that Caravaggio wrote, if I'm looking for his notebooks and sketchbooks that may not be in Art Store, I'm going to need to know those differentiations. Okay. So that's Art Store. I think most art students know Art Store. Let me move this. So that is Art Store. But outside of Art Store, what do we do? Where do we go with that? So another one is called the Google Art Project. I don't know how many of you know about this, but Google years ago went in and started digitizing collections. So let's just look at Caravaggio, okay? The way it's done can be a little freaky, the way it's laid out, but once you get to using it, it's really helpful. You've got two basically, I guess, sets of where Caravaggio is kind of the subject of them. We've got the artist Caravaggio, and then we've got different things about Caravaggio in Europe. It's a theme. We've also got the different collections of museums that house these pieces. I'm going to push this up here. We've also got different things like online exhibits that have something to do or some sort of connection with Caravaggio. We've also got the items. Okay, so if I can come through here and just identify the piece by site, because sometimes, like I said, it's got multiple titles or titles can be spelled differently and I'm having trouble finding it. I can come in here and if I know what I'm looking for, I can come in and do it that way as well. Again, just like in Art Store, they've scanned them at such a high DPI that you can zoom in and it calibrates. So very, very handy when you're trying to do things with artwork and you're trying to present and discuss, the fingers or the brush strokes or how he designed the, how the lute here does not have any decoration on it. That is something that's very important. Let's go back here. Goldman, I see that you've joined us. If you have any questions or anything, feel free to comment in the chat. If you have a specific artist or something that you want to look for, just let me know. Okay. And then you've also got views from the different museums and then other things that are related to Caravaggio that you can dig into as well. So it's a very handy resource to identify things and to try and find out where your collection might be. But outside of specific, you know, these are kind of more broad. Art Store and Google Arts are more broad, but there are lots of other museums that are digitizing their collections. So if you can't find it in Art Store, you can't find it in Google Arts and Culture, you may need to go into the actual museum websites. Okay, because Google started coming in and collecting things, museums said, well, wait a second. It brought up a huge issue on copyright and ownership of the images and things of that nature. So some of them may not be in Google. Some of them may be in an archives form. If you're looking for, you know, we typically think of art as sculpture and paintings, but it can be really a lot of different things, including illuminated manuscripts, different pieces like that, that might actually wind up in an actual library. Broadsides are a piece, you know, library manuscripts, that's where the stuff is housed, so that's where it's at. You've got the British Library image collection. One of my favorites is the Mary and Albert Museum. Okay, and this is a huge, huge museum of different things. And so you can go in and browse, you can go in and search by artist and try to identify and see if your collection or your piece is there. Any questions so far? No? Okay. So outside of this, how then do you find the other types of sources? So we all know, okay, art, we'll go get a piece of the artwork, but then how do you find other things? So we discussed how primary sources can be the artwork, but they can also be journals, diaries, autobiographies, correspondence, letters, sketchbooks, pieces of that nature. How then do we find those things? I mean, that's kind of outside of JSTOR, correct? So different ways to find those is going to be in some of the databases. So other than Art Store, I like to look in Worldcat to identify some things like that. Let's see. First. I'm going to make that. I'm going to leave that as keyword. Leave interview as keyword. I'm going to set my language to English, and that's crucial, guys. If your artist is Italian, some of these things are still going to be in Italian, and that can be kind of tricky. You want to set the language to whatever languages you can read at a collegiate level, because that's going to be the language of the item itself, what it's translated into. If it was originally published in Italian, sometimes the title will appear in Italian, but this way we make sure we're getting the English version. Any audience, not juvenile, any content, not fiction. Trying to remember, I think I did misspell this. See, I'm gonna have to Google him. Oh, I misspelled, okay. See, that's the thing. You don't have to capitalize, but you do have to spell correctly. Damien Hurst. Okay. So we've got information on him. This actually looks like, this is a exhibition catalog from when the most of the large art galleries, when they do a huge exhibition, they will come in and take very high quality pictures of the pieces that they're putting on exhibit. And then sometimes they'll include information with them, but then they'll also bring in scholars, usually for the grand opening of the exhibition. And they'll bring in scholars who will write papers on this. So the exhibition catalog is really what kind of the documentation that the exhibition happened, because once the exhibition is over, a lot of times those pieces will go back into dark storage. Or, you know, if they were on loan from somebody's private collection, they will go back to said private collection. So the exhibition catalog may be the only way to get a look at that piece. So sometimes those can be very handy. So the photograph of the piece would be a primary source. The commentary or the papers that the scholars wrote and presented at the exhibition opening would be a secondary source. So you can have both primary and secondary sources in the same piece. But again, if I knew that at this exhibition in 1965 in London, England, oh, I'm sorry, in 2012 in London, England, that this was where my piece might have been exhibited, then I might go after this catalog. Okay, four decades of art and conversation. Speaking of art, okay. So what this is different interviews that were done with different artists, and Damien Hurst is in here. So if I'm looking for interviews that were done with him, I'm going to go after this particular book. Now, if I wanted this book, what I would do is I could look inside at the table of contents, find the page numbers, and just interlibrary loan this one chapter. Or I can do borrow from another library and interlibrary loan the whole book. Usually I like to do just that one. If it's just one chapter, I will do that one chapter because they'll scan it and send it to me as a PDF, and I'll get it faster. But same thing, and you can't always go by the titles to these. So like this one, I've really got to go into it and see where Damien Hurst is coming up and look at it, whether he is writing about Damien Hurst. Okay, so he is somebody who has had a lot of research into Damien Hurst. If I'm looking for maybe a secondary source, that might be a good one to look at. So you really kind of got to go through these things, dig into them, look into them, because with humanities, they will title them some kind of weird things. I'm actually going to put some quotes around my artist's name. I want to leave him as keyword because like you saw, they may have him listed in the table of contents, not necessarily as the subject of the book. So I would like to leave him, the artist's name as keyword, even though it makes it a little bit more of a broad search. So we've got this here, we've got different pieces and things. We've got all kinds of stuff going on. This could be by Damien Hurst. Okay, so let's look at this. London. An interview with Damien Hurst. Okay. So that may be a good one that I want to do. This is actually an exhibition of his where they came in and he even did interviews. So that would most definitely be a piece that I would want to get my hands on. Okay. The other thing that you can do with older artists, like I said before, is like letters or correspondence, things like that. So let's see. Spell that right. Okay. So I'm looking for Monet and I'm looking for his letters or his correspondence. It could be in there either way. So I put in the or in all caps. That tells the system it's a command and we're looking for this. But I'm going to make Monet, I'm going to make him the subject, or Monet, sorry. It's kept all my limiters, so we're going to go ahead and search. So let's look at this one. So this is his correspondence. So this is letters that he wrote back and forth to different people. So you can really, I mean, we don't have any recordings or, interviews, recorded interviews of Monet. So this is as close as we're going to get to really seeing his insight. Is going to be his autobiography if he wrote one. Sometimes they will have, kept a journal or a diary if it's been found and translated and published. But a lot of times they're correspondence. As we know, artists can be very passionate, and they write about things that were going on during the time period that he was maybe painting the painting I'm studying. That gives me an insight into his psychological state. It gives me an insight into things that he was feeling and thinking at the time period, things that were bothering him, so that I can see that's going to be portrayed in his artwork at the time. And being able to say, okay, this is what was bothering him. Well, I know because his letters, he wrote it. He wrote it to this person. He was confiding in this person. So I know that it was bothering him. It wasn't just something that was going on and he really didn't care about. So that would be another primary source, because it's from the artist's hand, basically. Okay. So there's different ways to get these things, different ways to find them. If I'm looking for contemporary artists, the other thing, like I said, is going to be recorded interviews and stuff like that. So there's videos, there's documentaries. You can find some of those through Worldcat and be able to just say, okay, I want this documentary. The only way it is available is a DVD. I'm going to borrow it from another library, which I've done. Or I can do something like, again, spelling counts. And look at videos of him giving an interview. I mean, that's from his own mouth. So that would be all kinds of different things. I mean, that's a primary source that we can get because he is a modern artist, a contemporary artist. Anybody have any questions? Okay, I can see that my time is about up, so I will open it up for questions. If anybody has an artist they would like for me to look for. The other thing that I'll take a minute to talk about is a catalog raisonné. If you don't know what that is, I also have a tab on it in the art research guide. Okay. Catalog raisonnés are kind of like the record of an artist's piece. Sometimes they're done in small sections or organized in small sections. Sometimes it's the whole artist's breadth of work, and hopefully sometimes where it is. Again, if I'm looking for something that is in a private collection or is in dark storage at some museum, and not everything is listed online, unfortunately. So if I'm going after an obscure piece and I've got to find out where it is, or people use catalog raisonnés to check provenance, different things like that, this is going to be my go-to. And my favorite one is the IFAR. This is just phenomenal, I think. You can actually put it in, or you can browse artist names. Let's see. Okay. Edward Monet. Okay. So we do have one that's in preparation to be online. Okay, but we also have published catalogs, all sorts of different ones. So let me click on this one. Okay, and what I really like about this site is that it gives me information, and if I decide, hey, I really kind of want this one, they're giving me external links. At the Trust, I used to be able to say, everything that they had there was open, but it's not. Sometimes they don't. I can also go into Worldcat, which is worldcat.org, except the cookies. Okay. What I like about worldcat.org is that I can put in my zip code here and see the closest libraries to me that actually have this. So if I'm in a time crunch, you know, I may just pop over to Houston or something. But if not, and I'm like, well, okay, that's great. I know that it's 175 miles away from me. I need to interlibrary loan it. Okay, how to do that is you have to go to the OCLC first search. That's the other Worldcat that I was just showing you. And that's where you're going to get the borrow from another library button to do the interlibrary loan. It's a little bit roundabout, but really it's just 2 clicks that are all kind of embedded. So I like that, as long as you just know where they are. But again, it's a way to get your hands on the catalog so that you can see where this piece might be, where it's housed, or where it was housed in 1975, and track it down from there. Okay. Okay, now I'm going to open it up for questions. Anybody have any questions in the chat? Okay, well, thank you for joining me today. I hope this was a little bit enlightening. But if you ever have any questions, you can always contact me. You can contact us here at the library. They can get you in touch with me. But if you go to the research guide, or even if, oh, where's one on? You go to research guides, art, I'm right here. You can click on that and that will take you to my contact information. Or let's say you are in the art guide, I'm also right here. Okay, you can email me, you've got my office phone number, you even get my Zoom room. So if I'm sitting in my office, you can click on that link and we can talk via Zoom like this, or you can also, you know, set up a time to meet with me and we can meet via Zoom if that's how you want to do it. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.